as we're celebrating the 500 years of the Protestant Reformation, and as each night another emphasis of that Reformation is given, I was asked to speak a word about sola gratia, by grace alone. In Europe, some years ago, in an asylum, a sanitarium, a test was set forth to determine whether someone was sane enough to be set free from the sanitarium, whether they had gotten enough intellectual stability to be let go. And one of the crude ways that they would determine this was to place the inmate in a janitor's closet. They would turn the water on and put a stopper in the sink. Let the water fill up the sink and run over. They would give the inmate a mop. They would tell the inmate to clean up the mess as the water ran over from the sink that had the stopper in it. They would then leave the room for a couple of minutes and leave the inmate alone, whose task it was to mop up the mess. When they came back a couple of minutes later, if the water was still running with the stop in the sink and they were still mopping, they knew that person was not ready to go anywhere, because they did not have the capacity to understand the root of the problem. For hundreds of years, the church in darkness was trying to get people to mop up their sins through effort and merit, through indulgences. The then known Catholic Church, the Universal Church, had descended into a darkness that was engulfing Christianity, so to speak. Martin Luther rose up in 1517, and he came to Wittenberg door and he pulled the stopper out of the sink. He told people, you don't have to keep slinging your mop. You don't have to keep self-effort to make yourself acceptable to God, because acceptance with God is by grace alone. And that one of the five solas led to the Protestant Reformation, of which we are beneficiaries. When a person is in a contest and they win, they get a trophy. When a person is being recognized for an achievement, they get a reward. And when a person goes to work every day, they get a wage. But when you get a wage and you haven't worked, when you get a trophy and you haven't played, when you get an award and you haven't achieved, that's called unmerited favor. And at the heart of grace is unmerited favor. Grace can be defined as the goodness of God to people who do not deserve it, could never earn it, and could never pay back for it. For it is the God of grace that offers his goodness to undeserving mankind. And it was the rediscovery of grace that led to this Reformation, so that people could understand the biblical way to salvation. Grace is all that God is free to do for us, independent of us. According to Romans 11:6, grace is apart from works, For if it is of works, Paul says, it cannot be any longer of grace. And so what was reignited in the Protestant Reformation was an understanding that salvation cannot be earned, bought, paid for, or merited. To appreciate grace and to understand it, we have to understand the backdrop of our need for it, which will lead to the implications of it. A man came to a doctor one day to get the results of his test. The doctor said, I have some bad news for you, and then I've got some really bad news for you. Which do you want first? He said, well, what's the bad news? The bad news is I've examined your test, and you only have 24 hours to live. He said, well, that's the bad news? Yeah, that's the bad news. He said, then what's the really bad news? He said, I forgot to tell you yesterday. The need for grace comes up against some bad news and some really bad news. Paul says in Ephesians chapter 2 that you were dead in your trespasses and in your sins. That the human race was spiritually separated from God. And that was really bad news. He goes on to say in those opening verses that the world, the flesh, and the devil had teamed up to condemn the human race to a virus called sin for which it could not heal itself. That no amount of human effort, no matter how well-intentioned, could solve the problem of sin in the human race. The Bible declares that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And he calls that spiritual death. Now, granted, we do that at different levels of decomposition. In the coroner's report, some are really dead. Some are sophisticated and dead. Some are rich and dead. Some are poor and dead. Some are black and dead. Some are white and dead, but all are equally dead, separated from the life of God. You know, in days gone by, funerals were very crude. People would die, and then they would be put in wooden boxes. And after put in wooden boxes, they would be put in horse-drawn carriages. They would be taken to the cemetery. And then this wooden box would be laid in a grave, dug by hands and shovel with ropes wrapped around the top and wrapped around the bottom to lower them in. But when you die today, you die in style. There isn't a wooden box, there's a bronze casket. There's not a horse-drawn carriage. There is not only a limousine, but a fleet of a limousine led by two motorcyclists out in front. You've always wanted to stop traffic. You get to stop traffic that day and go through red lights. You find yourself at the internment, not with ropes around the casket, but being lowered down by a nickel-plated machine. But I'm here to tell you, whether it's a horse-drawn carriage or a limousine, whether it's a wooden coffin or a bronze one, dead is still dead. And so while people have different levels of decomposition and different atmospheres around their grave experience, the Bible has declared that all men are equally dead and separated from the life of God. But then Paul goes on in the chapter and introduces two words that can change any situation. But God. He introduces two words that can reverse any scenario. But God. He introduces two words that can open up graves and unhook caskets and dig out dirt and make dead things live again. He says, but God. And then he introduces us to how we got grace. And he throws together some theological terms that is easy to read, but equally easy to miss. Listen to what he says. He says, but God, being rich in mercy, because of his great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our transgressions, has made us alive together in Christ. He says that God had to have a discussion among his attributes, that he had to get together with himself, by himself, about himself. He says on one side there was the wrath of God, because he says in verse 3, we were children of wrath. Because God's perfection and his justice demands his wrath, because he cannot negotiate with sin, skip sin, flip sin, ignore sin. He must react to sin, because that's just the way he is. His just, perfect righteousness must react to that which is contrary to his nature. He cannot act like wrath is not part of his nature. But on the other side of his character, according to verse 4, was because of the great love with which he loved us and the mercy he wanted to extend to us. So on one side is justice and wrath, and on the other side is love and mercy. The biblical definition of love is the compassionate and responsible care for the well-being of somebody else. The biblical definition of mercy is not giving what a person deserves. So now we have a conflict of attributes. We've got wrath and justice, which must be mediated out. And we've got love and mercy, which is desired to be expressed. How can the desire to express love and mercy deal with the reality that justice and wrath must be executed? Therefore, God had to come up with a plan for his attributes to get along. He had to come up with a plan for justice and mercy to be okay, while simultaneously it being okay for love and mercy to be expressed. Since he could not look to his creation in order to resolve the problem, because the creation was the problem, he had to come up with an answer to address the conflict within the attributes, given the sinfulness of man combined with the desire of God expressing his love. And so he came up with a plan to resolve the problem in himself, by himself, for himself, to benefit mankind who could not help themselves because they were stuck in a graveyard. So when the four attributes got together and began to have a meeting, the God of the Bible came up with a plan, and that plan ignited another attribute called grace. When wrath and justice met love and mercy, creating a plan of redemption, expressing itself in the unmerited favor of God, God came up with a plan. That plan is no more greatly illustrated than when a young lady was driving down the highway and she was going 75 miles an hour in a 55 mile an hour speed zone. She was going 75 miles an hour many years ago in a southern town, and the policeman pulled her over. When the policeman pulled her over, he said, "Young lady, you going 75 miles an hour in a 55 mile an hour speed zone, and I've got to give you a ticket, but in this small town, it's the weekend, you're passing through, so I've got to take you to the court right now because you've got to pay the price." He took her to the courtroom, and when he took her to this single courtroom, the judge came in, and he said, "Young lady, you've been found guilty of going 75 miles an hour in a 55 mile an hour speed zone. So we're going to have to fine you $100. She protested, "But Your Honor, I don't have $100. He says, "Well, I can't change the law. You owe $100, or you can spend the weekend in jail." She broke out in tears and said, "But I don't have $100, and I don't want to spend the weekend in jail. Have mercy on me." As the judge looked down at her cry for mercy, he did something that astounded the bailiff and the policeman who brought her in. He pushed back his chair from behind the podium. He zipped down his robe. He left the bench. He walked and picked up his jacket, walked beside the young lady, reached in his pocket, took out a $100 bill and put it on the bench, unhooked his jacket, went back up and picked up his robe, zipped up his robe, went back to the bench, picked up the gavel. Young lady, you've been found guilty of going 75 miles an hour in a 55 mile an hour speed zone. The law says you must pay the penalty of $100 or spend the weekend in jail. Oh, but I see somebody else has paid the price. God, to satisfy the dynamics of his nature, came up with a plan where he left heaven's independent use of deity, put on a jacket of humanity, entered into time and space, died on the cross as a propitiation for the sins of mankind, rose from the dead, demonstrating that the payment for sin, tetelestai, had been received, and there was a receipt given an empty grave, demonstrating that salvation was provided to everybody in court who comes to the judge and says, I want mercy from the bench based on the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. But God came up with a plan to provide in grace salvation for all. It reminds me of the two preachers who were going south, and they went to this small southern town. One was from the north, and he didn't know how the south worked. And he sat down and they ordered breakfast. The lady came, the waitress came out, and she had on the plate eggs, bacon, but then she had this white gooey stuff. He said, what's that white gooey stuff? He said, that's called grits. He said, well, wait a minute. I didn't ask for grits. And I'm not going to pay for grits. She said, I don't think you understand. You in the South, you don't have to ask for grits. You don't have to pay for grits. You just get grits. It's just the nature of what we do. The beautiful thing about God's grace is the Bible says it is made available to all men because he just gives it away and gives it away and offers it at no charge. In fact, if you offer to pay for it, your payment will be rejected, because once it's of grace, it can no longer be of works. And so he says, but God, being rich in mercy, was willing to make salvation available to all who come to Christ for it. Now, we're all here evangelicals. We all agree with salvation by grace. But when Paul wrote Ephesians 2, he was talking to people already saved. He was talking to people already on their way to heaven. Why is he talking to them about a grace that they had already received? Because Paul understood that what often happens in the life of believers is they start out with grace, but then revert back to law. They start out with God's unmerited favor, but then they revert back to meriting something that cannot be merited. The Bible is clear that not only are we saved by grace, but we are sanctified by grace. That it is the grace of God that changes us after the grace of God has redeemed us. Many of our grandparents used a washing board to wash their clothes. They would scrub their clothes, and they would give all the human effort they had to get things clean. They would be tired and worn out, and the body would ache, not because they didn't want to be clean, but because there was so much work to make themselves clean, and then it could only be so clean because it was tied to their own human effort. But then through technology, there came a washing machine. And a washing machine forever changed how grandmother and her grandchildren got things clean. We no longer use a scrubbing board because we have something that has built in it a cleansing mechanism without all the human effort to make it work. What would you say to a grandmother for whom you purchased at no charge to her a washing machine who still insisted on using a scrubbing board? You would tell her she doesn't understand what she has. That what I have given you is much better than what you can pull off on your own. Often what happens in the Christian church is we tell people, let's get saved by grace, but let's get changed by law. When the Bible is clear through the Apostle Paul that once you have grace, you are no longer under law, because what law does is it tells you what's wrong, but it can't make it right. The law is like a mirror you go to in the morning to show you how jacked up you got last night. You go to the mirror and it shows you your hair's out of place, boo-boo is in your eye. You go to the mirror and it lets you know that you a hot mess. But you don't then take the mirror off the wall and wash your face with it. You don't take the mirror off the wall and comb your hair with it, because you know the mirror is only designed to reveal it. It's not designed to fix it. What God has so given us in grace, even after salvation, is a means to fix the very thing that the law condemns. But because we either do not understand grace, do not trust grace, or do not utilize grace, we do not experience the flow of grace. And Paul says in Galatians 5 verses 1 through 4, when you lose sight of what grace is, you fall from grace. And when you fall from grace, you are severed from Christ. So there are evangelical Christians who are cut off from Jesus Christ while they go to church, cut off from Jesus Christ while they have devotions, cut off from Jesus Christ while they sing praises, because they are living lives independently of a relationship with Christ by grace and not by merit. Now, when we understand this, he says in Galatians 2 that this grace that God has provided creates a relocation. Listen to what he says. Paul says, he says that when we were dead, he made us alive together with Christ. He raised us up together with Christ. He seated us together with him in a whole nother location called heavenly places. Now that's a favorite Pauline theological term, heavenly places. Heavenly places is a euphemism for the spiritual realm. In chapter 1, verse 3, he says your blessings are in heavenly places. In chapter 1, verse 20, he says Jesus is seated in heavenly places. In chapter 2, verse 6, he says we are seated with him in heavenly places. In chapter 3, verse 10, he says the church operates with the angels in heavenly places. And in chapter 6, verse 12, he says the demons operate out of heavenly places, because heavenly places is where the action is. Let me put it another way. Everything visible and physical is preceded by something invisible and spiritual. Everything visible and physical is preceded by something invisible and spiritual. So if you want to fix the visible and physical, you've got to address the invisible and spiritual. If you do not address the invisible and spiritual, you will not be able to address the visible and physical, because the visible and physical, which is the result of the invisible and spiritual, emanates from a whole nother realm called heavenly places. The job of grace is to cause us to operate from a whole different atmosphere than the atmosphere we live in. We live down here, but we're to operate from the atmosphere up there if we are to partake of the grace up there that has been disseminated for our responsibilities down here. And it is only when we grab grace at that level. In fact, he goes on to say in verse 7, grace is so spectacular. This thing that the Protestant Reformation got going. and that we're still having to learn about. It is so awesome that in the ages to come, that is quadrillion years from now, when I meet you at the corner of Gold Street and Silver Boulevard, he says, in the ages to come, God will be manifesting his grace. Translation, you ain't seen nothing yet. Because God is infinite, he is going to expose himself, since there will be no competing sin, so that every day, in fact, there is going to be so much grace in eternity, God is wiping out night so that you don't miss anything. He's going to give you a glorified body that can't get tired. He's going to keep it daylight forever, so that forever all you're going to see is God showing up, showing off. You're going to say, ooh, wow, God, ooh, did you see that? I mean, it's going to be nonstop exposure of infinitude by an infinite God in the ages to come. Verse 8 and 9, you have been saved. He says the Greek word for saved means to be delivered or rescued. He says all this is by grace. And it is by grace, and you are connected with him. You know, I've been the chaplain for the Cowboys, chaplain for the Mavericks. And when I do the Mavericks, they give me 4 tickets. They give me 4 tickets. I do the Maverick chapel. I tell some of the guys in church, I say, don't go on your own. You come with me. Because if you come with me, they charge you $15 a car to park. You don't have to pay to park because you're with me, and I get a free parking pass. So you come with me. That saves each one of you $15 from parking. When you come with me, we're not going through the general public entrance. We have a private entrance. And we have a private entrance because I can go through that entrance. But if you're with me, you go through that entrance too. Not because of who you are, but because of who I am. When we go downstairs, there's a 4-course meal. You don't have to go buy food like everybody else, because I eat for free. But you're with me. And since you're with me, you eat what I eat at no cost to you because you are with me. We then go in and we watch the game. When the game is over and everybody else is in a hurry to leave, we're not rushing because we're not going the same way they're going. We going up a private ramp, to a private elevator, out a private door, to a private parking lot, and we will be halfway home before most people have gotten to their cars, and that whole evening will occur because you're with me. So if you just hang with me, the rights and privileges of benefits that accrue to me, I can share with you, not because of who you are, but because of who I am. Jesus says, by grace, you're with me. And the rights and privileges of grace gets transferred to you, not because of who you are, but because of who I am. And if we would ever learn this thing of grace, that he says it is with him. So the point is, to experience more of grace, you must experience more of him. If you're in trouble with the law, you need more than a law book, you need a lawyer. If you're in trouble with a doctor, you need more. If you are unhealthy and need a doctor, you need more than a medical book, you need a doctor. If you are being attacked by criminals, you don't just need a penal code, you need a policeman. In other words, you need the visible manifestation of the book. Whatever is in that book, you need a living person to make that material in the book come alive to you. That is why Titus chapter 2 verse 11 is so critical. For the grace of God has appeared to all, bringing salvation to all men. And then he goes into, we look to Jesus Christ, because he is the dispenser of grace. That is why what Nick is talking about is so critical, because the more Jesus you have, the more grace you get. The less Jesus you have, the less grace you experience. So it is the relationship with a person that allows him to dispense the grace that he offers, which is his sufficiency for the life that he's called us to live. Grace is like Niagara Falls. It just keeps on rolling. Fish don't run out of water, animals don't run out of foliage, and we don't run out of oxygen because of the abundant supply. And since God has got enough grace for you, your life, your ministry, your program, and he doesn't run out of it, that relationship allows him to dispense not only what the Reformation called for, salvation by grace, but sanctification by grace, sustaining by grace, transformation by grace. It's all about the grace of God when we operate from heavenly places. Now that the introduction is over, he throws a zinger in here. He's been talking for 9 verses about grace. He's used grace 3 times in Ephesians chapter 2. You're saved by grace. You're sanctified by grace. By grace are you saved, not of works. It cannot be merited. It's what God does for us, independent of us. That's the only definition of grace there is. The moment you add merit, it is no longer of grace. Then wait a minute. Then if that's true, what about my responsibility to work? He knew you were going to ask that question. So he comes in verse 10 and he keeps grace alive. He says in verse 10, for we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand so that we would walk in them. You don't work to get grace, because grace cannot be earned. Grace cannot be merited. There is nothing you can do to make God give you grace, for then you would merit it and no one should boast. But what you can do is respond to grace. Your work, my work, our ministry, your service, what you do should be a response to grace. It is not an effort to merit grace. It is our appreciation for the greatness of grace that has been freely given to us. And the more of that grace you experience because of the work that you do. Notice the phrase, we are his workmanship, because it's about him. And he created us, saved us for good works. In other words, as out of our salvation, there should be a response. And you don't even get to choose the work, because which he has created beforehand. So he was already ahead of you before you got the work that you were responsible to do, that we should do for him. It's all about him, because it's all about grace. You know, I almost drowned when I was about 12 years old. I almost drowned in a swimming pool, but a friend named Donald reached in and pulled me out just in the nick of time. I got so shook up by that experience, I went on to become a lifeguard. I became a good lifeguard 50 years ago and 50 pounds ago. I became an excellent lifeguard, and then I graduated to be a water safety instructor, because a water safety instructor trains lifeguards how to lifeguard. You see, when I got delivered from drowning, I developed a passion to deliver other folk from drowning. So having been delivered myself, I became a lifeguard and a water safety instructor so I could give to others the very deliverance that I had experienced myself. You see, when you never forget where God brought you from, when you never forget where you were drowning in the graveyard of sin and death, you can't help but show appreciation by becoming a spiritual lifeguard and delivering others through good works. Not to earn grace, because grace cannot be earned, but to respond to grace, because grace is great when it is given. He says that this grace is God. You know, there's a movie, The Hanging Tree. The Hanging Tree with Gary Cooper. This is an old movie. Gary Cooper is a doctor, and he's in an old western town. And this young man gets shot. And Gary Cooper goes, and Gary Cooper works with him and takes out the bullet and saves the man's life. The young man said, "Doc, you saved my life. What can I do for you?" The doctor looked at him and said, "Well, I tell you what, you can be my assistant And you can be my assistant for the rest of your life, because that's how long you would have been dead if I hadn't saved you. When you understand that God has saved you for eternity, it's okay to give him a few years of your life in history, giving him an appreciation for the magnificent grace of God. When you understand grace and you respond to grace, as grace, you get more grace for God to do more in you, through you, for you. But when you leave grace, even when you're doing ministry, you get cut off from grace, and then you are severed from Christ. And so you do not experience the availability of the grace that God has given. While you can never earn grace, you can always access it. Romans chapter 5, verse 2, we access this grace by faith. So you access it, but you never earn it. And then in the last section of the book, I want to throw you an uncomfortable comment for some of you, because he doesn't leave the subject of grace. He throws in an adverb after talking about what grace is, after discussing how grace works, the union we have with Jesus Christ, and the flow. You know, when I was a boy, the way we took baths in the inner city of Baltimore was the way we went swimming in the inner city of Baltimore was the fire hydrant. Every Saturday, the fire marshal would come and flush out the fire hydrant. We put on our bathing suits and we go swimming. We just let the water run on us as we were playing in the fire hydrant. But something always bothered me. I went to my daddy. I said, Daddy, that 3-foot fire hydrant, how does that have all that water? He said, boy, that fire hydrant doesn't have any water. It's underneath. It's hooked up to the dam. And the dam provides, through a pipe under the ground, the water you're getting out of the hydrant. When he explained that to me, I understood that their flow from the dam, which was much bigger than what I needed for my swimming lesson. That's how grace is. There's more grace than you can ever flush through your life. But when you open up that flood and God is able to flow to you and through you, because you are now being of benefit to others, you are now seeing what God can do that only God can do, for which only God deserves the glory. You're merely a hydrant through whom he can flow. And then he says, therefore. Somebody say therefore. Because see, whenever you see therefore, you need to ask what it's there for. Therefore always means in light of what I just said, in light of what I've just talked about, in light of what I just explained. That is, in light of my discussion about grace. And then he gets sensitive. Because he says, in light of what I said, he goes from verse 11 to verse 22, and he says, there should be racial healing in the church. He says, verse 13, but now in Christ Jesus, you who were formerly off have been brought near by the blood of Christ, for he himself is our peace, who has made both groups into one and broke down the barrier of the dividing wall by abolishing in his flesh the enmity which the law of commandments contained in ordinances, that he himself might make two into one new man, thus establishing peace, that they might be reconciled both into one body to God through the cross, and having killed the enmity. Let me put it this way. When grace hasn't gotten big enough and flowed strong enough to bring racial healing, Paul says in chapter 2, you don't understand grace. Because one of the things that the good works of grace will do, verse 10, is in verse 11 through verse 24. It makes the two into one. No longer is there illegitimate division between Jew and Gentile when grace has been understood. Because in the grave, you're just dead. In the grave, it doesn't matter. History, background, culture, color, class. In the grave, you are equally separated from God. In hell, you are equally separated from God. But he made us alive, an understanding of grace. So what this says is that the American church, in the divisions that we've had in history and in the divisions we still have today, don't understand grace. Because Paul says if you understood grace and you were doing good works, then you wouldn't have this division, because the cross brings peace. Whenever my wife makes me a sandwich, it will always be with mayonnaise. I don't eat mustard sandwiches. I am not a mustard guy. I am a mayonnaise guy. Now, mayonnaise has some ingredients that don't get along. Two ingredients in mayonnaise that don't get along is oil and water. Mayonnaise has oil and water. No matter how much you stir it together, push it together, force it together, oil and water are going to go back to their different end zones, because they understand their component parts are not meant to get along. But the reason I can eat mayonnaise is because of a process of emulsification. Emulsification is a process of taking two things that can get along and bringing them together in harmony to create something new, special, and in my case with mayonnaise, tasty. So the reason why I can eat mayonnaise is because introduced to oil and water is egg. And what egg does is egg reaches out to oil, then egg reaches out to water, and I say, no, I know y'all don't like each other. I know y'all weren't raised together. I know y'all come from different backgrounds, but Evans wants some mayonnaise. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reach over here and I'm going to reach over there, and even though you don't relate to each other, both of you relate to me. And if I can get you water to relate to me and you oil to relate to me, I'm going to intermix with both of you so that Tony Evans can have a mayonnaise sandwich when it's time to eat. Guess what grace does through the cross of Jesus Christ? It reaches out to the black guy. It reaches out to the white guy. It reaches out to the poor guy. It reaches out to the rich guy. I know y'all come from different backgrounds, different histories, but my cross and the grace dispensed from it can take folk who are divided and bring them back together again. That's what grace does. And when grace is missing, Paul says, there is division in the body. That's why I love the story. And I know I'm out of time, Jerry. I'm winding down. But this is getting good to me. That's why I like the story in Galatians chapter 2. Because Peter is eating ham sandwiches with the Gentiles. Peter's in, because see, he got that thing on the roof in Acts chapter 10 where God told him, don't call unclean what I call clean. And now, he had heard about pork chops, chitlins, and pig feet, but he had never tasted it because that was an unclean animal. But now that he had to go to Cornelius' house, he found out those folk on the other side of the track knew how to cook. And so now in Acts chapter 2, verse 11, he's eating some ham sandwiches with the Gentiles, some pork chops with the Gentiles, some pig feet with the Gentiles, some hog maws with the Gentiles, and some chitlins with the Gentiles. He's just having a pork-eating good time. But then, while he's eating with some of his homeboys, some of his boys from the hood showed up. Some of the Jews sent from James showed up and saw their Jewish pastor eating with them people on the other side of the tracks. When he saw that, he said, I can't be with y'all anymore because I might offend my own race. So he got up and went back to the Jews in order not to let them be upset with him, because he was fellowship with these people over here. We got to live with them in heaven, but that don't mean we got to eat with them on earth. So Peter got up, and the mist in the pulpit is a fog in the pew. It says when Peter got up, the rest of the Jews who were with him got up. So they got up too. It goes one step further. It says even Barnabas was carried away by their hypocrisy. Not my boy Barney. Anybody but Barney. Barney was born in Cyprus. Cyprus is a Gentile colony. So he was born in Gentiles, went to school with Gentiles, raised with Gentiles, played ball with Gentiles. But that's how bad racism, classism is. It'll make a good man bad. So Barnabas got up and he left too. And they would have gotten away with it except for one thing. Paul wanted some pig feet too. So Paul shows up and Paul says, when I saw what Peter did, I condemn Peter before them all, but guess why? Not because of racial reconciliation, not because can't we all get along, not because of a seminar on race, not because of a holding unity candles. No, I condemned him because he was embarrassing the gospel. He was shaming the cross, and he was abusing grace. And the greatest verse on your identity in Christ, I'm crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, it's Christ who lives in me. The life which I now live, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. That famous verse comes at the end of this story. See, everybody quotes the verse, but they leave out the story that led Paul to say the verse. That verse is Paul talking to Peter and saying, you don't know who you are, you've forgotten who you are because you've missed the cross, and when you miss the cross, you've killed grace. And so when grace is at work, the unity of the church is in focus. Grace is a big deal. It's a saving deal, a justifying deal. It is a sanctifying deal. It will be a glorifying deal. It is also a unifying deal. And if we ever get grace right, and Jesus is free to flow, just free to flow. He doesn't have to hold back grace because we're going to abuse it. We're going to fall from it. We're going to be severed from him. I can't deal with that. That's why we have all these prayer meetings and these prayers aren't getting answered for unity and revival, because we're asking God to revive a divided church. He can't do that because that's against his nature. You see, God is one God composed of three co-equal persons. The Father is not the Son is not the Spirit. These three are distinct, yet they are one. It's like a pretzel with three holes. The first hole is not the second hole is not the third hole, but they all tie together by the same dough. You see, it's all just one thing, but three distinct persons. And when he has a divided body, he cannot be the unified God that he is. So we can pray till we blue in the face, but there will be no revival. There will be no transformation. There will be no breakthrough of the grace of God in the culture if he has to do it through a church he can't identify with. So he says, when you understand grace, it shows up cross-culturally, cross-racially. In conclusion, for real this time, a lady had a major scar on her face. Major scar. Ugly. Her daughter would never invite her to any things at her school. She wouldn't bring any friends over to the house. She wouldn't do any of that because she... She was ashamed of how ugly her mother looked with this horrific scar on her face. One day her mother came to her and said, "Darling, why won't you ever invite me to your school functions? You never bring your friends over here. When I ask to meet them, you never let me meet them. Why?" The daughter said, "Mama, I hate to say this, but it's your scar. It's your scar. That ugly scar. I'm so ashamed. I'm sorry I feel that way, but I can't get over the scar." She said, "Son, daughter, have a seat." Sit down. Have a seat. Let me tell you about my scar. You were a baby in the crib. I was out hanging up clothes on the clothesline. I saw smoke coming up through the roof of the house. I screamed, "My baby, my baby." And I rushed inside, and the smoke was engulfing my baby's crib. I picked up my baby to run out of the house. As I was getting ready to run out of the house, a beam collapsed and struck me on the side of my face as I threw you through the door. And it burned me. So you have to understand, every time you see this scar, it's a reminder of the price I paid to deliver you. Every time you see the scar and don't want to talk about me to your friends, you just need to remember this scar saved you. Every time you see the scar and you don't invite me to be where you are, I just want you to remember, is this scar. That's the reason why you can go to those events and have these benefits and have your friends. Just don't forget, when you see this scar, it's because I was delivering you. My brothers and sisters, when you get to glory, and you're walking on those streets of gold and going in and out of your mansion with your brand new glorified body, you'll all be the age approximately of Adam and Eve, which was the perfect age of adulthood when you enter into glory, and all of the flaws will be removed in the glorified body. There will be no tiredness. There will be no diseases.